Pakistan and Learners Republic. Women in Energy Pakistan is a professional network to support women working in the energy sector, Pakistan. And Learners Republic is a community of learners, scholars, practitioners, readers in the natural sciences, social sciences, and humanities. I'm Maha Kamal, and I'm the co-chair of the Islamabad Hub of Women in Energy. I'll be co-moderating this discussion with Naveed Iftikhar from Learners Republic. I myself work in the intersection of energy and climate policy, and I'm currently a faculty member at the Information Technology University in Lahore. Dr. Naveed Iftikhar is co-moderating, as I told you, and he'll be joining us. Thank you, Dr. Naveed Iftikhar, for your collaboration as the founder of Learners Republic. Please tell our audience a bit more about your diverse policy practice experience.
Thank you, Maha. Hello, everyone. I'm Naveed Iftikhar. I'm an economic policy practitioner. I worked at Ministry of Finance, and I've been working with international organizations as well. So I work closely with the federal government and provincial governments in Pakistan on a number of economic policy issues. And I'm an academic. I teach at various universities. So I think before starting our session, so I think it would be appropriate to share with you some housekeeping rules. So I'll share with you, and I'll request everyone to comply with these rules. And the first thing that we want to request everyone that please ask questions in the chat panel, and moderators will pose those to speakers on your behalf. The reason is we have many participants, so it will be good that you pose your questions through the chat mode so that we can take a notice and we can redirect these questions towards our panelists. And we will be communicating in English entirely today because of the diverse nature of our audience. And today's session will be recorded. And I'd like to share with you the structure of our event today. We will be having a three-part discussion. The first part is going to focus on economic impact. The second panel will discuss legal aspects relating to energy sector. And the third one will be dealing with the environmental aspects of energy sector. And our first panel, so I think we can start our first panel now. There are participants who are still joining, but we can start, I think.
Yes.
So our first panel will be on the economic impact. We have with us today a distinguished panel. So let me introduce you our panelist for the first session. So we have Sadia Qayyum with us. Sadia is the co-chair of Islamabad Hub of Women in Energy, Pakistan, and she's working as energy specialist at the World Bank. So our second panelist is Khurram Lalani. Khurram is an experienced energy and infrastructure consultant with over 10 years of experience in policy and investment projects, both locally and internationally. He is principal at Resources Future. Our third panelist for this session is Seher Abbas. Seher is an economist and energy policy consultant. She is currently working on IFC's energy efficiency program in Pakistan, which focuses on advising manufacturing companies in resource efficiency improvements. Ehsan Anis is our fourth panelist. Ehsan has over 11 years of experience working in the power industry in the fields of strategy and finance. He is currently head of strategy and commercial at K Electric Limited, and only private and vertically integrated utility in the country. So I would request all participants to please mute your mics when you are not speaking. So when you have to speak, if the host allows you, then you can speak. Otherwise, you can share your comments and questions through the chat panel. So thank you very much. Over to Maha Kamal.
Hello, thank you, Naveed, for making the introductions of our distinguished panel on discussing the economic impact of COVID-19 on energy and climate in Pakistan. So my first question will be directed to Ms. Sadia Qayyum. Sadia, COVID has impacted employment and economic activities across the country. It has an impact on energy demand as well. How do you foresee the energy demand in the post-COVID-19 period, considering the fact that we're moving towards a high energy demand season for domestic use?
Thank you, Maha, for that question, and thank you, Naveed, for kicking off the session. Before I talk about what is going to happen with, actually, the first thing, there's no post-COVID. The COVID is here. I don't know when, but there's uncertainty about when the vaccine is going to come out. So if we foresee that at least for the next for 6-7 months, this COVID period is going to continue. But before I start talking about the energy demand, in COVID times, let me briefly talk about what was happening with the Pakistan's power sector before this, because it is important for that context. Now, we all know that Pakistan's has a circular debt, sector cash flows have been a problem, and the last government added a lot of capacity, projecting a demand growth of 6 to 7%. But I mean, the change in government happened, and then because of we had current account deficits, structural deficits, because of which the present government embarked on structural reforms, and the economic activity slowed down. So what we saw was that in the last couple of years, instead of demand growing at 6 or 7% that the government had projected, the demand was only growing at 2% or 3%. And the projections for the next 20 until 2023 24 was the demand would not grow more than 4%. And because of the high power cost, we saw a lot of industrial consumers that were moving away and were actually going towards captive generation. And that meant that the high capacity payments of all these new power plants that had come in, and the capacity that is going to come in, it's going to be divided over a lower quantum of energy, which means basically a higher tariff for the consumer. Now, the cost of service in Pakistan is around 19-20 rupees per kilowatt hour, but not all of it can be passed on to the consumers. Also, our capacity, and this is something that the next session will be talking about, that how capacity payments are linked to dollar, is indexed to dollar. So the Pakistan saw a rupee devaluation the last 1 year, last 1.5 year, because of which our capacity payments have increased a lot. Now, this was government before COVID was struggling to arrest the flow of the circular debt, and we know that we're in the IMF control period, because of which there's a lot of pressure on the government to reduce the power costs. And that's why Prime Minister basically asked the Ministry of Energy to come up with out of box solutions for reducing the power costs. So this was until March, and then comes COVID, and you have a lockdown which is enforced by the government, and everything, all the economic activity comes to a halt. Now, the numbers that we've gotten from CPPAG and the Ministry of Energy is that the demand in March actually went down by 30-40%, where commercial demand went down by 75%. Industrial demand went down by 65%. Domestic consumption would have increased, but that a little, but as now everyone's sitting at home, but we know that 70% of the domestic consumption is subsidized, and the industrial and the commercial consumers, which is actually cross-subsidizing, or which are primarily the main contributor of the revenues, their demand is low. So the discos in March actually collected 61% of the amount billed, and usually it's 90-91%, as we know what the collection ratio is. But and this is based on February billing. For March, it's going to be even worse. And the reason for that was that as we know, the Prime Minister and the government announced that anybody who's consuming up to 300 units, they can pay their bill in monthly installments over the next 3 months. Another problem that discos are facing, and this is particularly true for discos like HESCO, SEPCO, and KESCO, where they have manual billing. So they weren't able to go because of the mobility restrictions, and actually the meter readers could not go and read the meters, because of which they weren't able to bill the consumers. So the recoveries were down to 61%. I'm talking about private recoveries. The government recoveries would also be lower for these discos because the provincial governments are now reallocating a lot of money from different budget heads to the social sector now. So all in all, what the revenues of the sector has gone down already, and this is based on the February billing, and it's going to further go down. I mean, when we're talking about industrial consumption gone down by 65%, commercial consumption gone down by 75%. That is a major loss in revenue. And since the lockdown continues and nobody knows until when this lockdown will continue, when are things going to go back to normal, when economic activity will recover, what kind of industries will be allowed to open, though some have been given the green light, and the macroeconomic indicators do not look good. And what's happening is, and the government, I mean, this is beyond the control of any government, right? Nobody could foresee that that COVID-19 would hit us and would hit at such a rate. And the cash flow problem is not just particular to Pakistan. All the countries are facing it because the electricity demand has gone down. But it's just that Pakistan already had this circular debt problem and cash flow problem. So for us, the problem is further escalated. And foreseeing this, CPPAG actually wrote to the IPPs, I think 3 or 4 weeks ago, asking them to go to their lenders and request to defer their principal payments for until June, because it is going to be difficult for them to be able to pay the generators. And the concern that we have right now is to keep the utilities afloat, because there can be a situation where the government, CPPAG, does not have enough money to pay the IPPs to keep running the plants. And we are heading into summer months where the demand is going to grow, air conditioning load is going to come, and so we're going to have more hydro generation as well. But compared to these months, but also, I mean, because domestic consumption is coming in, your industrial demand, industrial and commercial consumption will be lower than the usual. So it is, the sector cash flows are not going to look any better. Might improve a little, but then again, it's based on a lot of assumptions about what the scale of the pandemic is going to be. So I mean, the oil price, and the fellow panelists can talk about that, it has helped Pakistan, but the capacity payments and this reduction in energy demand doesn't bode well for Pakistan's power sector. And just one last thing before I stop, while your industrial and commercial demand is decreasing, something that this crisis has actually shown is the disparity in energy access. So what we never talk about is how, you know, some provinces are very low electrification rate, and why this issue is important is because a lot of health departments and energy departments are finding it difficult to provide uninterrupted supply to the health facilities, to the isolation centers and the quarantine centers that have been established. I mean, last 5-6 days, I've been reaching out to every provincial department, asking them if there is any urgent need for electricity. And the feedback that we got, particularly from KPK, Balochistan, Gilgit-Baltistan, was that they're struggling to provide 24/7 reliable electricity to a number of health facilities and isolation facilities. So going forward, I mean, right now they're responding to it in any way that they can, and it's mostly through diesel generators, which is putting a burden on their already stressed resources. But going forward, I think it will be important for the government to think about their electricity, electricity policy, to consider energy access issues as well. Because I mean, if you have another pandemic, God forbid, this is not the problem that the government needs to be thinking about. So I'm going to stop here. Thank you, Maha.
Thank you, Sadia. I think that's interesting to know how this demand is going to impact the sector and the economy as well. So we'll be moving forward towards Khurram Lalani. Khurram, can you please add to this energy demand issue that Sadia has raised, and particularly it will also make sense for us if you will also mention installed capacity at the moment and what we are looking for in the next 2 to 3 years, and how this energy demand and supply mismatch is going to create problems for the economy and the sector. Khurram.
So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Naveed, for inviting me over. And Sadia has already given a very comprehensive answer, so I'll just take things forward from there. I think if you look at current mix that we have around 26% of the industrial base in terms of units sold, almost 7% for commercial consumers, and almost 3% of the bulk consumers. So I mean, combine industrial, commercial, and bulk, you already have around 35, 36% that has already gone out. So I mean, keeping in mind that this lockdown continues for 3 odd months, or how long does it really go on? We don't really know at this point in time, but I think bulk of the energy demand is going to be impacted. To me, I think the rough estimate is already 30 to 35% of the total electricity demand. Now, the really hard thing about this crisis is that there's not really a demand thing. I mean, it is a demand constraint, but at the same time, it is also a supply constraint. So we're seeing that, I mean, there are shocks from both the sides. We have global supply chains that are already disrupted. We have, industrial consumers, commercial consumers not really using and utilizing the energy. So going forward, it's going to be very tricky to actually ascertain the real impact. And anything at this point in time is going to be little too early. My personal opinion is that unlike, I think, previous times when oil prices would go down and consumers would benefit, consumers used to benefit because they would have net positive income going forward. In the current scenario, I don't really see that happening because even the oil prices have come down. We don't really have consumers who would be able to have a positive impact out of it. So, I mean, taking the overall balance from the demand perspective alone, I think it is going to be very tricky proposition if it continues for a very long time. Sabia is right that it's going to shave off around 35% of the demand, and I think roughly I was calculating that translates into an annual impact of somewhere around 200 odd billion. So I mean we already have circular debt situation where we have low cash flows. Add to that these 150 to 200 billion rupees of additional quantum, and you will have increasing circular debt flow building up, which is obviously going to be a challenge for the government.
Thank you, Haram. So we understand that manufacturing sector is going to get a big hit in the future in the wake of COVID-19 situation. Seher, your work is focused on manufacturing sector. So if you can share with us, what do you think that how the future look like in the manufacturing sector of Pakistan? What should we expect in terms of energy demand in the manufacturing sector, considering this export contraction and domestic demand contraction as well? Seher.
Thank you, Naveed. So you're right, like we're working from IFC. I'm part of their resource efficiency project that works on the manufacturing sector. And one of the biggest sector that we work in is textiles. And textile, as you know, is probably one of the biggest casualties of COVID-19. Apparel industry globally has been hit significantly. It doesn't fall into essentials anywhere. So as big as malls and everything else has been shut down, demand significantly has dropped, which means that a lot of brands who outsource from countries like Bangladesh, Vietnam, and Pakistan have started canceling orders. So a lot of orders from Pakistan's textile industries were completely cancelled, and after several back and forth through the global brands, we came to the point that orders for which the raw material was already purchased and were in processing were to be completed, and then they can be shipped and then paid off for that. Even for those, as shipment and transportations curtailed globally, there have been cases in which like the production has slowed down and the material that was produced is parked at ports, and even the brands have asked for delays in payments. So when COVID-19 started off, end of 2019, that was the time when Pakistan was enjoying a very small jump in demand in textiles specifically because China went offline temporarily, and significant demand increased for Pakistan. So when you look at exports, our exports doubled in textile apparel industry, ready-made garments in February. And obviously there's a buffer of 1 or 2 months raw materials. So the closing of China did not directly impact instantly in terms of getting raw materials which are imported from China. However, after that, everything shut down. So we were not able to ride the entire cycle of increase in demand for textile, which also meant that now that rest of the world was going into shutdown, China was opening up. So there's a significant fear from the supplier end in Pakistan and manufacturing who are exporting different products to global brands, is that as supply chains will now be reevaluated, and businesses that are global brands that are being impacted, and they will look at their bottom line, they will obviously start shutting off offices in supply, like different countries, right? And where overhead costs and other standards are not clearly met and the costs are high, they would most likely not go back there. So there is a significant concern in the supplier end in Pakistan, at least in textile, that once big brands close their sourcing offices here, they might not come back. So there's like a concerted effort through like IFC and ILO. We have a Pakistan Buyers Forum in which we're trying to negotiate with the government on how they can support the manufacturing sector, textile specifically. And similarly, other sectors have also been impacted, but textile is one of the most significantly impacted, like globally. And just to touch briefly on the oil prices, like Khurram discussed it in detail, I just wanted to touch on like, so around like import bill, obviously the current reduction in oil prices, like it's gone like at a point less than $20 a barrel as well, which meant that it was like probably lowest in 25 years. So, but then oil markets are very volatile as well. So there are different consequences of the oil price crashing. For Pakistan, temporarily, yes, it might benefit in terms of import bill, and our trade deficit has reduced by somewhat 30%. And our imports, like oil imports, are 25% of the total import bill. So there will be some relief, but very short term again. And also, when we talk about, just briefly touching on tariff, like power tariff, there will be impact on the levelized cost of energy for thermal, right, as prices go down. And that should, the way tariff works, mean that if tariff goes down, there will be a discussion of whether this benefit should be passed on to the consumer. But because our distribution companies, like Sadia pointed, are already struggling with cash flow, and Essen will talk in more detail, I guess, I'm sure there's a question as to should this benefit be passed on to the consumer or retained by the utilities. And like there like different stuff that you read around, like there's a lot of analysis being done on COVID right now, and there is a discussion that if we give benefit to our industry, they can, like, once slowly this starts, slowly and gradually lockdown starts being relaxed and production starts again, maybe things can go back to normal relatively quickly. But I doubt that will happen because, for example, if I'm taking the case of textile industry, even if our industry opens up, even if things slowly start going back to normal, demand for apparel will not, like, literally not go back to the same next day. So your textile will not start producing, even if they have that, yes, their cost of production can go down with cheaper electricity, and also like their energy purchase would go down as cost, but they will not be able to ramp up production immediately, because obviously there'll be a back and forth as to how the market is evolving. And then there's a lot of discussion going on how the supply chain and technology will figure out in this entire manufacturing sector post COVID-19. But then, like Sadia said, there's what post COVID-19? It's happening right now, and
very
it's
true.
very fluid.
Thank you, Seher, for summarizing and explaining so fully the impact on manufacturing and how that's going to impact energy demand. Now I would like to pose a question to Essen. Essen, K is the only private and vertically integrated utility in the country. So we wanted to ask you, could you tell us something about the current power sector challenges that the private sector faces in particular, especially during this pandemic?
I think, thank you, Maha. And when you come last, you generally are not left with much to talk about. So I'll start with a controversial statement that, despite the fact that there has been a lot of pessimism right now and the crisis of power sector, but generally this is one of those sectors which the need will still arise. So it's not something like airline or something which generally has a complete closure or a going concern issue. So I'll try and summarize the challenge which Khurram and Sadia also mentioned. So when you generally say that the demand has gone low, what does it mean for a utility, or what does it mean for any energy sector, is the fact that your industrial base or your commercial base is something which uses electricity throughout the day on a similar pattern. So you don't have to have ramp ups and ramp downs. But now you're only left at this point in time is only residential demand, which has its own peaks and troughs. So that also puts a pressure on the electrical network available to the system as well. The second is that this country has this phenomena that the industrial base and the commercial base has the lowest theft in the country as well. So they cross subsidize the residential and the rural population. So the figure which Khurram probably mentioned has two components attached to it. One is the fact that the entire, because of the adverse mix, there would be around 200 to 250 billion of just the T&D losses not being there, T&D losses going up. The second is the propensity to pay issue of consumers who are unable to pay at this point in time, both in terms of the deferment by the government of Pakistan for 300 units and more, which Satyam mentioned. I'm just trying to tell that it's probably 50 to 60% of the population of Karachi which gets that benefit, and it would be 3 installments, not just from April, but then May and then June, then subsequently. So it's a long-term deferred credit which government has announced for consumers. The second fact is that because your best consumers, the industries, the high-end cement and textiles, are not paying you, that also means that so there are two components of this 200 billion. One is the 200 billion T&D losses. The other 200 billion is the deferred credit, and since the deferred credit for residential consumers, it's not easy for them when things get normalized, as Seher mentioned. Everybody will not have that much of income. No employment would be there, and there would be a lot of issues pertaining to that. So that would also impact the entire sector. However, having said that, the whole issue of around cash flows and everything, you also need to be cognizant of the fact that generally in Pakistan, most of the discos, 9 of them, all discos except K-Electric, is a public, is government owned. The second fact is that all of them have a tariff which is cost based. So eventually, this entire cost which would be occurred, if in principle, would generally be then absorbed. Now the question comes that will the government be able to pass it on to its next generation, next year and year so, because the post-COVID situation is unclear for every one of us. So I'm giving you two perspectives here. One is that the entire panel generally discussed that there was this crisis situation in the power sector, which I completely agree. But that is more to do with short-term power crisis, which will happen as we speak. If the way that the discourse tariff will work and the way deferred credit will eventually come back, this sector is not something which you won't start not using electricity a year from now. It's not like you won't, but probably the cruise industry, you will not be even going next year. So, the flights will have different issues. The airlines will have different issues. So it's not that kind of sector. So I'm saying that the short term is a major issue. However, I still feel that there is some optimism on the long-term viability of the sector itself. Sorry, Maha, your mic is mute, I think.
Okay.
Thank you, Essen, for flagging that. All right, so thank you, Essen, for explaining private sector perspective as well. We're just going to take one more question from Seher on the impact of oil prices, and then we're going to close this session and then open to Q&A. So Seher, would you like to tell us about the impact of oil prices in particular? Because we're facing the lowest demand in 25 years in terms of oil prices. So what are the opportunities for Pakistan as a country that has been dependent on oil imports?
Yeah, thank you, Maha. So like I mentioned, from July 2019 to March 2020, $9 billion was our oil import bill out of a $34.81 billion of a total import bill. That's around 25%, right? So as oil prices go down, obviously the import bill is expected to go down. And though our exports have also gone down, but our imports have gone down by around 18%, which meant that recently we saw a 30% reduction in the trade deficit. So that does fare in a positive way for Pakistan. And there is discussion that maybe this might be a time for fuel stocking, for increasing our reserves. So for increasing our reserves. However, one thing to keep in mind with oil is that there's a lot of volatility. So that is something like this. Yes, obviously it'll take time for things to bounce back, because obviously things will not start going back even if tomorrow everything is opened. It will take time, and obviously it is a smart decision to not open everything straight away. It will be gradually done. Some industries will be open, transportation will slowly and gradually start opening. Tourism is probably one of the worst hit like industries of corona. So fuel use and transportation would obviously slowly and gradually start going up. So in Pakistan, from that perspective, yes, currently in the short term, there is a benefit, but we'll have to closely monitor how the prices go up and down. And obviously in the next panel, we'll talk about renewables. So I'm not touching that directly, how oil price is gonna maybe slow down the shift to renewables. But yeah, that's to quickly answer your question.
Thank you, Sahar. So we will be moving towards questions from participants. We got one question from, I think there was a question, I'll refer it to Khurram Lalani. Khurram, there was a question on the impact of this energy demand and COVID-19 crisis on LNG and coal prices. So if you can also comment along with oil on LNG and coal, so that will be good. Khurram Lalani.
Sure. I'll just take on from where Sahar has concluded. I think a lot of people are saying that we are going to see a lower fiscal deficit, a lower current account deficit, which is all going to be true. But at the same time, I think you also have to see that the privatization list that we had for this year included OGDCL and PPL. They're not going to be as lucrative now, given the very low oil prices. The fact that FBR collects a lot of taxes from the oil sales, from the petroleum product sales. We have a GST component, we have petroleum levy component. Those are going to be out. So I think there's, on one hand, we are going to witness something of a lower current account deficit. But at the same time, it's going to be a hit on our revenues as well. And regarding, I think, again, so on the LNG prices and on the coal prices, I think, yes, I mean, we will all witness a lower international market prices, which are going to result in very good prices for our generation. But at the same time, I mean, we are not really certain about the supply side at this point in time. So the demand side and supply side both are, really murky at this point in time. Really hard to say that, how things are going to materialize. But I think what we've seen is something which is unimaginable. I mean, OPEC Plus has cut output by 12 million barrels per day, and yet, I mean, that's very significant. But at the same time, what we are seeing is the oil price are hovering around at around $20 per barrel. So such a massive cut, and yet the prices are extremely low. It is something which was completely unimaginable, even a year ago. So I think we're living in very interesting times. Very hard to predict, what comes next. But yes, fingers crossed.
So thank you, Khurram. Sadia, I'll move towards you. So we have a couple of questions, and people are asking us about moving forward. What would be changes in energy policy? Particularly, they are also referring to potential changes in energy mix in Pakistan, including renewables. What we are seeing in terms of changes in demand and supply side of COVID-19. And so, if you can just mix these questions of what changes can we expect in terms of energy policy, energy choices, and energy mix, so that will be good. And there is one last question on the pipeline of coal-fired projects as well. So everything is regarding energy mix and energy policy.
Right. Thank you, Naveed. So, I mean, on the energy mix, we know that the government has already committed a number of coal power plants, and some of them are under construction, so you can't delay them, you can't do anything to them. Some of them have reached financial close, though we've been working with the government to slow down the coal plants that are coming online, at least those which haven't reached financial close, they can be delayed. Because even pre-COVID times, we understood that the demand wasn't going to grow at the rate at which the projections had been made by the previous government. But going forward, I don't think this is the right time to determine what the energy policy should be, because if you look at right now, the demand is low. So there, it doesn't make sense for any new investments, right, including RE. But as Essen was saying, electricity demand is going to stay there, right? It will take some time for the industrial demand to come back, for the other demand, for commercial demand to come back, and domestics and people to be able to pay for that electricity demand. But it's not going to go away. So yes, we need to. The timing of when these power projects come is extremely important. But I think what this crisis has told us is it's very important to not be dependent on imported fuel for power generation for your meeting your energy needs, because we know that global supply chains have been disrupted. So any dependence on imported fuel is going to take you into trouble. So this is a time when the government actually starts thinking that we need to maximize utilization of our own indigenous resources. And this is something that we're actually going to talk more in the third session when we talk about RE investments. But I mean, I think going forward, that's what we need to think about, how we can minimize our dependence on imported fuel and actually utilize hydro, more wind, more solar plants, and yeah, I think I'm going to stop there.
Okay. Thank you, Sadia. We're now going to be closing this session, but there will be time for Q&A at the very end. We're now going to be moving towards the second part of our discussion, which is going to be focused on the legal aspects as related to the impact of COVID-19. We have with us Ms. Natasha Jahangir Khan, who is a distinguished policy professional. She is an ADB consultant working with the Ministry of Energy and Ministry of Finance. Natasha will be speaking today on the power sector, while I will speak a bit about LNG. So Natasha, what are some key regulatory challenges in Pakistan's energy sector, just to give everyone an overview before we dive deeper?
Thank you for having me on this panel, first of all. I think in Pakistan, the energy sector, the key challenge is the footprint of the government in the energy sector. We have two types of regulators in Pakistan. One are utility regulators. I'm talking broadly right now. You have the utility regulators, and then you have the financial sector regulators. In the financial sector, except for a few areas, the government does not have a very large footprint. So you'll see that your State Bank of Pakistan, your SCCP, have been much more effective regulators in terms of development of the market and growth of the regulated sectors there. In the petroleum sector and in the power sector, the largest shareholder of the utility provision is the federal government itself. So you set up regulators and you set them up as tariff setting bodies, and they're basically giving tariffs to the federal government. And that in Pakistan has led to a major sort of power tussle between the regulatory bodies and the federal government, because the regulator, in a sense, is regulating the government, but the government feels that these are bodies that we have set up and they're part of the state. I feel that in Pakistan, that has been the biggest challenge towards energy regulation. And there have to be mechanisms that address the relationship between the federal government and the regulatory bodies in the period between now until when we, inshallah, hopefully transition into sectors with less of a federal government footprint in them.
Thank you, Natasha. Natasha, just we have many participants who are from energy sector, but there are others who are not actively involved with the energy sector. So if you can just help us to understand what are these take or pay contracts, or how do these contracts result into capacity payments, and what are some of the changes that we should have introduced in such arrangements that would have favored Pakistan and energy sector markets on a more sustainable basis?
I think the panelists in the previous segment touched upon this as well, but just in very layman terms, in order to explain it, let's say one power plant is producing 100 units of electricity. When the federal government enters into a power purchase agreement with a power plant in Pakistan, the standard terms of the contract are that they will pay them for that full 100 units of electricity regardless of whether they're actually taking those 100 units of electricity or not. Now, like Sadi also explained, that we've not had a demand that has been commensurate with the capacity that we've been adding on in the past few years. So you have set up a lot of power plants that have committed their entire 100 units of capacity to the federal government, but the federal government is not able to utilize that 100 units, and continues to pay them for it. That is what is known as a take or pay provision. So either you take the electricity or you pay for the capacity being made available to you. That, I think this provision in the power purchase agreements, the standard power purchase agreements, should have been revised quite some time back. But I think what's happened in Pakistan, we've had these cycles of, and I think the issue is also political here, other than being technical, that electricity has been a very large focus of most of the political parties. So every party that comes in commits to providing electricity to everybody. And the understanding so far has been that provision of electricity means adding generation. And you will find that your power policies in the past have always been focused more on adding generation to the overall energy sector, without taking into account the distribution segment or the transmission segment, right? So because your transmission and distribution is unable to take full capacity to every person in Pakistan, we've gotten stuck in this sort of cycle where we keep paying for energy which we're not using. But I think more than that, one of the things that should have happened, and this is something that there was a move towards in 2018, is that we transition out of the current system of energy where the government purchases all the electricity and the government is also the seller of electricity to the end consumer. And we move to a system which is a multi-buyer system, in which multiple parties are purchasing and selling electricity. Because in the multi-buyer system, what is expected eventually, if you have a good policy and a good regulatory framework in place, that the demand drives the generation. One power purchaser is contracting with multiple parties and not just with one government. So the capacity burden is not on the federal government, but is spread out over multiple buyers. This is provided for in the NEPRA Act as of this moment. But unfortunately, there was a certain licensing regime that was to be introduced under the amended legislation, which is not yet in place. And we have continued to enter into long-term PPAs even the last 3-4 years, despite there being provision in the law for the last 2 years in giving the government the space to transition out of this current single buyer model that they're in. So.
Thank you, Natasha. I think a couple of years ago, you and I both struggled to work with NEPRA on some of the changes that we tried to introduce. So yes. I'd like to just ask you, moving forward, you mentioned competitive market, multi-buyer model, and in that sort of market, how do we need to re-envision the role of NEPRA actually moving forward? So that regulatory regime that is required for this multi-buyer, multi-seller market or competitive market in short.
So I think you've kind of hit the nail on the head here, Naveed, because I think the regulator itself felt that it would become redundant if it was not giving tariffs. What we need to understand is that when we move to a multi-buyer market, we are introducing at least 3 or 4 new classes of licenses. That means that the regulated sector of NEPRA is going to be substantially enhanced. The more important function that the regulator should have been playing and should be playing more proactively in the multi-buyer market is that of a market developer. So the first step is giving rules and regulations which are conducive to allowing players to come in, investments to come into the sector. The second thing is the role that has been given to the regulator under the amended act is that they have to support the federal government in the development of the policy and plan. This provision was put in specifically to try and improve the coordination between the regulator and the federal government. The third thing that, the third enhancement of role of the regulator would be on the enforcement side. And that is going to be a very large task for the federal government to ensure, because now theft comes under their purview, overbilling comes under their purview, issuing of licenses comes under their purview, and compliance with the licensing conditions comes under their purview. And this is not something that happens only when the license is issued. This is a continuing obligation of the regulator to be interacting with the market and allowing the framework to support the growth of a market into a fully competitive market. And I think NEPRA can play a very, very positive role here in that transition, because I think they have the capacity relative to the federal government. They have more technical expertise on this side than the federal government does. So I think going forward, the role of the regulator is going to be substantially enhanced. But the regulator needs to realize this themselves.
All right, thank you, Natasha, for highlighting the role of the regulator, particularly NEPRA in this regard. One of the questions that comes out of this is that in the past, NEPRA's role has traditionally been looking at tariffs, right? But as we're in COVID-19 right now, there's a move to extend subsidies to the most vulnerable sections of the population, right? What implications do you think that these subsidies may have for tariff structures during this crisis and post-pandemic?
I see two major problems. One is that subsidies, no matter how well intended they are, will encourage inefficiency unless you target them very, very, very successfully. And Pakistan has not been very successful in targeting subsidies as successful as they should have been. The second problem is that once you give a subsidy to somebody, how do you withdraw it? So while right now in the COVID situation, you might be giving subsidies to certain classes, and I understand that is a political and social compulsion of the government. But do they have a plan to withdraw from those subsidies going forward? I think it's going to be very difficult, because a benefit of this nature, once given, is politically very difficult to withdraw. So I think whatever subsidy they give should be done in a very, very targeted and very well-planned manner.
That's very,
thank you,
very
Natasha.
true.
Yeah, thank you. Maha, you've been asking so many questions to others. Now this is your turn. So I'll be posing a question to you, and that is, there are a couple of questions relating to this issue by participants as well. And they are asking the viability of force majeure. There have been claims in the media that there is a possibility that government can go for force majeure for energy sector contracts and renegotiating some of these contracts, particularly LNG contract. So can you please share your perspective on this force majeure and this renegotiation of contracts?
Great question, Naveed. So I'll be speaking to the LNG contracts in particular when it comes to force majeure and what options Pakistan has. And I'll let Natasha speak to the power purchase agreement part of it because of her experience in the power sector. So coming back to LNG, it's very unanticipated what's going on in the oil markets right now, with Brent hitting today it's at $27.73 per barrel, right? So that was very unexpected when it came to how the oil market normally operates, right? So this sharp fall in oil prices has meant that in terms of our long-term oil contracts, we were first seeing this divergence in terms of LNG spot prices seem to be half as much as those in the oil market. And for Pakistan's particular case, especially our long-term contract with Qatar, what we were seeing was the fact that we entered into a deal that locked us, basically the contract is tied to oil prices, right? But depending on the percentage of how much it is tied to, if it's Brent, if it's JCC, that might be different in terms of the percentage. But what's absolutely important is that if you lock yourself in a particular percentage as in oil prices in a long-term contract, then you don't gain as much benefits when it comes to when oil prices are falling as rapidly as they are right now. Especially because even LNG is in oversupply at the moment. We might see these things changing as we're moving to the summer months. particularly for those countries whose power is dependent on LNG. Let's say Japan, for example, right? In Pakistan, we also generate some of our power from LNG, so that might change for us as well. But in terms of in this low price environment, Pakistan may pay more than levels at which it is currently sourcing cargo, right? So there's a certain level of price in terms of oil when it doesn't become as smart of just like making your electricity out of oil as we had been doing previously. Getting that benefit from generating power from LNG means that you have had to secure your contract at a price that is at that parity, right? So for us to secure those benefits in terms of LNG, that's up to a question. And particularly, I guess, even when we were signing our long-term contracts, that's the question that keeps coming up, that when spot prices are that low, do you even enter into long-term contracts? And then people have been pointing towards the whole idea of force majeure, right? That do we do we tap into force majeure and say, okay, the contract needs to end thanks to COVID? The problem with that, however, is that Pakistan's contract with Qatar is not just it's not just a completely market-based contract. It's based on a relationship with Qatar as well, in terms of a country as well. So especially because of the fact that you might save money, but might be at the cost of your relationship in terms of international relations, right? So that's an opportunity cost that Pakistan needs to consider, right? Do we claim force majeure at this point at the cost of our relationship? Another point to add is that force majeure again is one of those. It's a crisis move, right? So it's a short-term move that you may claim the benefits right now in terms of reneging on your contract. However, the point to consider is the fact that as we move towards our summer months, we may still continue to need that LNG to produce our electricity. So again, does that make economic sense then, right? So I'll let Natasha add more on the power purchase agreements and if force majeure may impact.
Yeah, thank you, Maha. Natasha, we have a couple of questions from participants as well. So let me try to club those questions into two categories. One is obviously what Maha mentioned, that some participants are also asking about potential and viability of renegotiation of PPPA and PPAs. And the second question that is emerging out of it, you mentioned about multi-buyer model or a competitive market. So there are participants who are asking that what sort of changes do we need to move towards that competitive market? Do we just need legislative policy, or what sort of hardware, software changes are required? So we can start with PPPA's renegotiation, and then we can move towards changes those are required to move toward a competitive market.
On the PPP renegotiation, that is, I think, given that there is, even other than COVID, I think the circumstances of Pakistan have changed substantially since 1994, 2002, 2006, 2013. We've had various power policies. Globally, in many developing countries, once these countries come out of the sort of electricity shortage aspect, many of them have renegotiated the power purchase agreements. I don't think that COVID-19 is a reason for us to renegotiate the power purchase agreements, because the energy sector is something like Essen said, after COVID, during COVID, energy will always be used. Your demand might go up and down. So COVID is not a reason for us to renegotiate. But generally, yes, looking at our current scenario, looking at our outstanding payments, the impact the existing PPAs have had on our economic situation, the federal government can consider renegotiating the power purchase agreements. But that's a policy decision that has been, and that is a policy decision that has to be taken by the federal government and spoken to with the sector itself. Now, as far as the competitive markets are concerned, the legislative amendments have been put in place. But the legislative amendments themselves have given a number of other actions that have to be taken in order for a competitive market to be implementable. The most important thing there is the introduction of a licensing regime of a market operator, of market traders, of retailers, and of a system operator independent of the NTDC. In order to give that licensing regime effect, the federal government and NEPRA had to sit down and set out a number of rules and regulations which would sort of outline the technical requirements of having these bodies in place. Until you get these market players operational, you cannot have the competitive markets to be implementable, number one. The second thing that is proposed in the law, section 14A specifically, provides a mechanism for there to be a broader policy to address a transition to competitive markets, to address liquidity of the competitive markets, to address the increase of renewable energy in the sector. There are a number of heads that are given in the law itself. That broader policy has to be approved by the CCI, and under that policy, the federal government, in consultation with the provincial governments, and this is very important, that consultation has to be undertaken with the provincial governments. They have to give 5-year plans. Now, what has happened is that CPPI has given a plan, which NEPRA has approved. The federal government has not yet given the statutory policy and plan. Nothing has gone to the CCI. As far as I'm aware, the consultations with the provincial governments have not even started yet. And the reason why I say consultation with the provincial governments is very important is that if we try and implement a policy or a plan or a regulatory framework in which we do not have the buy-in of the end users who are residing in these provinces, it will be very difficult for us to implement that plan and policy, number one. One last thing is that the role of CPPAG as a market operator is going to require some software changes as well, because the law says that the system operator and the market operator have to get sort of their regulations, or the commercial code and the grid code as we know them, approved by NEPRA in a manner that they're consistent with the new market structure. So while the broader law might be in place, but the law itself says that you have to take these further steps within a period of 5 years before we can move to competitive markets. One last thing I'd like to flag here. This law became effective in May 2018. And one of the provisions there was that generation would be delicensed over a 5-year period. What we have seen is that delicensing plan has not been given by the federal government, and NEPRA has continued to issue licenses for a substantial amount of further power in the last 2 years. So these are things that the federal government needs to look at and address.
Yeah, I think it's done. Maha, you can start the discussion.
Sure. I'm sorry, I think we've lost Natasha, but let's move on, and we'll continue once we have her back again with us in our Q&A session as well. Let's move on to the third round and its speakers. Our third round is focused on the environmental impact, particularly as it relates to energy and climate in Pakistan. Thank you to Umar Malik and Kamil Kudus for joining us for speaking about this environmental aspects of our discussion. We're now going to be looking at the energy and climate intersection, but from a holistic angle. So we're going to cover a lot of themes, and at the very end, we'll open to Q&A. So we have with us Umar Malik. Umar is the CEO of Shams Power, a leading distributor of a solar generation company of Pakistan. He has 18 years of management experience in energy, and he's quite a distinguished profile as well. Also joining us is Kamil Kudus, who is an energy and environmental policy researcher who has worked with public, quasi-public, and private clients, and he's currently a policy researcher with the PM Task Force on Energy Reforms. So Umar and Kamil will be in conversation with Sadia Qayyum for this session on the environmental impacts.
Thank you, Maha.
Sadia, over to you.
Thank you, Maha, and thank you, Naveed, for moderating the first two sessions. We're going to continue the discussion, and as Maha said, we're now going to talk about what is going to be the impact of COVID on RE transition, clean energy transition in Pakistan, climate change, implications of climate change. So, Umar, my first question is to you. So in the first two sessions, I don't know if you were with us, we were talking about, especially in the first session, we were talking about how the demand was already low compared to our installed capacity and has further gone down. And nobody knows when the post-COVID world will start and when demand will pick up. But we know already that there are people within the government who are against any further investments, including RE. So how, and now we're also seeing a crash in oil prices, RNG prices have gone down. How do you think all of this is going to impact the RE transition in Pakistan and any further RE investments? Or do you think, on the contrary, the government is going to realize that we actually need to reduce our dependence on imported fuel and maximize our utilization of domestic resources? Over to you, Umar.
Thanks, Sadia, for having me in this webinar today. So I think it's an interesting combination of factors that is going on right now. We have COVID, which has reduced the overall demand, but you also have the oil price crash, which is taking place. So I think the government stuck between a couple of difficult choices. If they move towards RE right now, which they haven't moved in the last maybe 4 or 5 years. If they move now, they let go of an interesting opportunity to lock into cheap oil prices for the future, which could mean, maybe 5-10 years of long-term contracts on conventional fuel. That said, you also have the overcapacity issue, which the government seems to be using over the last many years. So, I can tell you a little bit more about the business that I focus on, which is not utility scale solar, which is distributed solar. I think this is going to be a fantastic opportunity for people to realize that even saving 20%, 30% on your electricity is huge. Just 4 months ago, we were talking to customers about reducing their electricity costs by 20%, and they'd sometimes feel that was not significant. Now 20% will definitely seem significant enough. Secondly, you will also, I think, start to see that the acceptability of solar has generally gone up in the last 4 or 5 years. We've seen more that's executed in Pakistan, more mainstream companies have adopted it. So there's the acceptability of the technology is already there. But what is hopefully going to also happen is that companies will start to seriously commit towards a roadmap where 20% or 15% of their electricity must come from renewables. I see that happening more from the private sector than from the government. I'm more bullish on private sector commitment to renewables than I can say about the government.
Thank you, Umar. So a follow-up question actually to Kamil. So you work with the government and the Prime Minister's Task Force on Energy, and I know that you're also working with NICA. Do you see a role of energy efficiency measures over here, especially now that we know businesses are stretched for resources, and they want to reduce their power. They want to reduce their power costs. So is there an opportunity for them to do that through energy efficiency measures, and the role that the government can play in scaling up the energy efficiency work that has been done in Pakistan? And we all know that energy efficiency is quite nascent, and it started off a few years ago, and now this government is also taking interest. But how do you see the role of NICA and the government, and also the role that energy efficiency can play in helping these business industries?
Thank you, Sadia, and thank you, Women in Energy and Learners Republic, for having me on the panel. It is quite pertinent. So I'll try to couple a bit of what the other speaker said and you as well. Both renewable energy and energy efficiency for the past 4 or 5 years or so have been basically pushed from the private sector. there were market forces, it was much more economically feasible for the customers to do it. And the government had that lag in it. Now, with regard to renewable energy and those investments that are going to happen because of the renewable energy policy, they are still going to be much more determined by the market, because it's much more that we have seen off-grid. It's basically not the on-grid, but the off-grid that they have much more penetrated into the market sector. However, on the energy efficiency side, it's a completely different landscape. Energy efficiency, I think, would come in much and much more handy in this time. Everybody, even if households or firms, businesses, SMEs, small and medium enterprises, all of them, what they do want to cut their expenses. And this is where you come in. The best amount, the best kilowatt hour or the best unit of energy is the one that you never consume, that you do not need to consume. And that is going to be very, very important for the upcoming months. We do want to have that, okay, we are going to facilitate people, households, and firms with deferment of payments, getting all of the burden on the exchequer and not putting it on the common people, because that's what the government wants. But on the other hand, we also need to aware them that the government is not going to get any recoveries. And that is what you discussed in the first session as well. We are not going to get a lot of our recoveries. And that puts 100 billion, 200 billion, even more, because your monthly cash flow is around 100 billion for your discos. So that's adding much more. So it should be a combined effort on parts of DISCO, on part of NICA, energy efficiency, and as well as NEPRA, I mean, among all of the stakeholders in it, that they should encourage for energy efficiency and conservation. It's good that we want to see more renewable energy into this sector, more distributed energy generation, more distributed energy resources. But it has to be that it's much more behavioral than institutional. In my home, in my life, and the way I deal with my lifestyle, we need to cut down on not even on our emissions, but on the way we use energy. And that is going to be much more forward. And I think where the government can jump in and help is to facilitate this information, to not provide any kind of asymmetric information, provide much more transparent information on energy efficiency and the potential of it, and not just technical, not just with technology, but it has to be with your behavior, your social mindset. There has been a lot of other things that we have tried to touch the religious tone in it, that we do not want to waste our energy, waste in our religion and the socio-political context that really fits in. And that would really help, I guess, if we continue that path.
Thanks, Kamal. But if I look at the other side of the coin and I actually put the cap of CPPAG of the Ministry of Energy, who has this problem that there is not enough demand. The COVID crisis has further exacerbated the cash flow problems. And on the other hand, we're saying energy efficient, the consumers should implement energy efficiency measures to further reduce their demand. There's going to be a problem, right? So since you're working with the government and with NICA as well, how do you see we strike a balance between these?
So you have to see like the both ways, and we have to come up towards a balance. On one side of it, it's that we want to increase our electricity demand. We want to sell more electricity because that's the way to recover all of your capacity charges and all of the burden that we have in our economy. And so what we want is actually more sales on the distribution side of things. On the other side, we also want households, firms, that they should pay less for electricity and they should consume less electricity, not just for the environment, but for their own sake as well. It makes economic sense, as I just said. Sorry. So on both sides of it, in this COVID scenario, what I am saying, in this COVID scenario, it makes much more sense because our recovery is already going to be very low. And if electricity usage is much less, that would help in terms of energy efficiency and to the households. Now, if we have to come up towards the government side, it's very important to understand that I'll also comment on the demand side. So currently, if I would say your current demand right now is going around 11,700 megawatts. It's the peak that is coming up around 9-10 p.m. If we would see April 2019 demand, do not take into account the weather. There's a bit of flexibility with weather and weekdays and weekends. It is just short of like 2,000 or 3,000 megawatts, and much more dent that has been brought up for the consumer is in the tariff classes, which are small consumers, small industrial consumers and commercial consumers. We have lost like around 60 to 70% of our industrial demand. That is much more for that sector. So it's a bit of both of these two balances, because you would have to be very precarious in this thing and need to evolve your strategy. It's not a one strategy that would fit at all, and it would not be a strategy that, for example, with all the data and everything, if I come up towards now, would be applicable maybe a week later as well. We don't know. So we need to be very, very careful that whatever we test and try now, we need to change it a little bit with regard to how the future comes up and how the demand goes up. And demand is not just for our residential demand is going okay. It's a little bit much more for domestic, commercial, agriculture demands, and for those consumers that cannot afford it. And for example, that's another point that I want to raise in that with the same comment. It's important for us to realize that there is a political wait for us to defer payments, and it's fine to defer payments. But if you are going to waive off all of your bills up to 300 units, it could be good for the household. But on the state side, how the state should react with the market, and if state is in this very hard cash business of electricity, energy, and all of it, so much of that burden, should we be doing this thing with completely wavering of up to 200 units to 75% for 300 units? And would we be able to sustain it, or we would be applying for more bridge financing and try to see what can we come up with your short-term fixes, and we'll see what happens with the energy afterwards after 1 or 2 years. So it has to be a very balanced approach, and it needs to be communicated with with the stakeholders. And with stakeholders, I mean the primary stakeholder is your consumer, your domestic class, because that is where you need to give them the confidence of how tariffs, if they need to be changed, how it would be changed and how it would not be changed. So they need to adjust their budgeting, their household budgeting with regard to that.
Thanks, Kamil. Umar, if you want to add on this, because I know that PITCO is advising the government on energy efficiency, but also a question to you on how the COVID crisis has impacted your business and your supply chain. And also, do you think in the post-COVID time, there will be appetite in the businesses and industries for solar installations, or would they be too stretched for resources to think about this? And the reason I'm asking about profitability and the impact of COVID on the business is because we see that off-grid companies are suffering from liquidity issues. This might not be a problem for you, or maybe you can comment on it because you're working with urban consumers. But has your supply chain been disrupted because of this?
You asked a couple of questions, and just to follow up on what Kamil was saying earlier. I mean, energy efficiency is something, if you look historically to the industrial sector, or if you look at the domestic sector, the appliances sector, none of the, well, I should say none, but a large part of the development has taken because donor agencies like USAID, World Bank, and others led these programs. These were seldom led by our government departments. I mean, even Enercon, when it got established years ago, was done by USAID at that point. So, whereas the last 10 years have been about setting up new power plants, one of the things that IFIs can do going forward is to focus more on energy efficiency. And I don't mean just getting audits done or feasibilities done, but bringing good suppliers to market and assisting those good suppliers who are tested for their efficiency standards with some form of in some incentives so that they can penetrate the industrial sector. you will see that there are very few programs where when is for instance, in the textile sector, a lot of the energy efficiency that's taken place has been buyer-led. Companies that are going to European or US apparel companies, those companies have mandated energy, water, wastewater, chemical, dye usage standards, which our companies are then compliant to because it is a compliance matter. And once they actually start complying to it, they realize that the energy efficiency benefits that they're getting make them more sustainable in the long run, financially, as well as having them stand out amongst their peers. We did a project recently where we audited and compared the efficiency of about, I think, 15 Pakistani manufacturers of garments to about 300 factories all over the world for a leading US apparel manufacturer. And all 15 Pakistani ranked higher than the global average. And not just by a factor of 5 or 10%, these were probably 40-50% higher than the global average. So there are possibilities to outshine global competitors by being more energy efficient, being more resource efficient. Now, the second question that you asked was how will COVID affect this? I think COVID will affect this actually quite negatively. Previously, when we used to talk to companies about energy efficiency, there was always in mind that this is a 5-year, 6-year payback, and I have other things right now which are a little more to put my money into. That desperation will actually be far more now. This is not business as usual circumstances. So it's not like they're going to come back to work and start their factories and say, okay, we need to save 10% on energy. The rush will be about, making sure that other things which are more important are taken care of. So I think energy efficiency will definitely, if you leave it to industries, will take a back seat. Can the government play a role? Yes, definitely when it comes to auditing, certifying the equipment that is available in the market, coming up with standards for it, controlling the import of substandard motors, for instance. Pakistan still imports motors by weight, not by the efficiency or the nameplate data, but by weight. Second-hand motors come into the market. So that is something which the government can stamp down upon, which will definitely help. NICA is doing a wonderful job with labeling, and NICA is doing a great job when it comes to coming up with policies and standards with other regional energy efficiency conservation. So more in that same line will definitely help. But I think the IFIs will have to take a greater role when it comes to putting some more financial assistance, whether it is in the form of concessional loans through the state bank, whether it's in the form of some kind of subsidy incentives to the industry or to suppliers. In India, for instance, the World Bank has created specific funding lines to the Central Bank of India, which are specifically for energy efficiency that lend at 8%. So if a cement factory or a spinning unit needs to go and buy motors for $2 million, they can actually submit a case, which is only to buy energy efficient motors, and they'd get a loan at 7 or 8%. So those are areas that we could work on to promote energy efficiency. I think a lot has been done in the last 10, 15 years with energy auditing and telling factories what they need. A lot more needs to be done now on making financial instruments and enabling those financial instruments in our own context.
One thing, Sadi, if I can add up here.
Sure.
Yeah. So I'll just add for this that not only with regard to the technology and audits, as the speaker said, is important, but as you rightly pointed out, it's basically with regard to especially COVID-19 is the liquidity issue. And previously as well, people have been not only for renewable energy, but for energy efficiency as well. People have been very much cognizant of the fact that, okay, you have to spend initial cash and initial capital cost out of your own pocket. And that during COVID-19 discourages your energy efficiency or renewable energy or any kind of investment in that regard. So much more that I would try to link two things is one is the State Bank of Pakistan green banking guidelines that we had. They were issued like back in September 2017. And those has those kind of lending option that 6% for solar and otherwise. It also includes energy efficiency, but energy efficiency and those loans have not been really standardized up to that, and commercial banks are not giving it. So one way forward that needs to be done, especially with regard to COVID, is that those financing options from commercial banks for any energy efficiency investment during this time should be facilitated. And this is where you can basically facilitate your end consumer who really wants to invest in energy efficiency with their technological option. But again, I would stress, it's just not the technology. It's much more have to regard with your lifestyle, how you live your life, and with regard to your emissions in that regard. Secondly, what I wanted to stress with regard not just energy efficiency and renewable energy, it's actually the way our grid is designed. From a monopolistic, vertical integrated utilities of, I would say, 1970s, up to now what we are seeing, energy transition going towards distributed energy resources, to not just the concept of prosumers. This would readily change all of your approaches. From vertically integrated utilities back in 1970s to the concept of prosumers, where there is bidirectional flow of electrons and bidirectional flow of financials and cash, that is where we would be going forward to. And where are we right now? We are at a place where we have these horizontal structures of distribution companies, transmission, generation, IPPs, that we have so wonderfully designed and unbundled with the help of all the financial institutions and World Bank. But what has this done? The unbundling, and I think the privatization of generation, which took place, I guess, 2 decades from a vertically integrated monopoly to a relative market structure. This has not reaped Joe's claimed and marketed benefits, and the sluggish process of the reform with the end goal that GOP should not be in the process of running this kind of sector was pragmatic, but poorly executed. And maybe some of the stakeholders do not have that much of the appetite to now see that, okay, we will open up transmission, we'll open up distribution, private sector would come in, and it would all be wonderful and paradise. We are at a stage where the grid is from 500 kilowatts from the generation up to 220 kilowatts distribution and up to 11 kVs and to your homes where your voltage comes at like 220 volts. All of this is a very old structure, very fragile grid as well. We have been doing advancements. There have been HVDC lines from Matiari to other ways, but this has been very old. Now, I want you and all of the panelists, as well as for the audience, to compare it with the demand side. Now, the demand side, solar, battery storage, wind, smart grids, microgrids, mini grids, prosumers, all of this, these are very advanced. It's like you are trying to connect your Nokia 3310 with an iPhone 10 and trying to see how would it go on. Whenever you're going to focus on this reality, your demand side technology should be able to communicate with it, and then typically go on with regard to as it evolves, because it's all at every second how your electricity goes. And that's why we needed very much high demand and spinning reserves at that same end. So with regard to technology, summarizing my point, energy efficiency and renewable energy as well. All of these, when the market forces are right, and these are going in the right direction of technology advancement, these have to be connected with the grid. And if they're unable to follow it with the grid, we are going to be in a very bad situation.
Thank you, Kamil. So what I'll do, I have a few questions from participants before moving to Maha. She'll also be posing a few questions. So the one question is from one of the participants. Let me read it. Umar, I'll request you to answer it. And this is, when do you think we can move to a PPA model for rooftop solar RE through private companies? Currently, due to the legal regime, discos have a monopoly to sell power. So I'm just reading a question from a participant. So what I understand from this question, they want to know that discos have a monopoly right now in the distribution system. So under this system, we won't be able to have more renewable energy through distributed models, what Kamil was referring to earlier as well. So Umar, what is your opinion on this issue?
So actually, that's not entirely true. We have a policy which allows for distributed power generation to take place. My company, Shams Power, was the first one to be awarded a distributed generation license from NEPRA, which was about 3 years ago. And we have about 14 sites that are now under NEPRA issued generation licenses where we sell electricity to private customers. We have this in perfect accordance with the law, and that that said, there are some concerns with PPA projects which are covered under generation licenses. For instance, one concern is that you cannot net meter electricity from a site where there is a generation license from NEPRA right now, because under the law right now, you cannot have 2 generation licenses for the same power plant. In the first instance, when my company approached NEPRA that we wanted to sell electricity, for instance, to Metro Cash and Carry or Akzo Nobel or Packages Mall, who are our customers, NEPRA issued us a generation license. And in the second instance, when Metro approached the distribution company that they would like to sell electricity to Disco, the Disco had no problems with it, but when they went to NEPRA, NEPRA came back and said, we've already issued for this power plant a generation license to Shams Power, so we cannot issue a second generation license for the same power plant. So that is something that we are working with NEPRA. Us and a couple of other PPA providers are working with NEPRA to amend the laws accordingly, because places where you have Saturday and Sunday off, that is 104 days gone in the whole year. Then you have other holidays, so you're losing about 25-30% of your power if you can't net meter PPA sites. Consider universities or schools, you would lose 60% power, summer holidays, winter holidays, Friday, Saturday, everything after 3 p.m. So those are things that need to definitely change. But to answer the person's question who was asked this, there is a policy and it is allowed under NEPRA regulation.
Thank you, Umar. Umar, I have another question for you. I think you'll be able to respond to it. This is a question that, is there any policy or plan for local manufacturing of solar panels and other equipment for RE market, more focus on local manufacturing rather than imports?
So to the best of my knowledge, there is no policy that promotes or encourages local panel manufacturing. In India or in the Philippines, for instance, the policy that does encourage that is that in grid connected or government procured power plants, they would give some kind of advantage or some kind of benefit if you were to use local panels. Now, I'm not advocating that we should set up local plants or come up with policies to manufacture panels locally. Our demand for solar panels is nowhere close to where it needs to be for us to think about local panel manufacturing. The economies of scale are such right now that China produces panels better and cheaper than anywhere else. Whatever money we want to put into setting up subsidies for that should be set up in promoting renewable energy penetration. And lastly, I think if we even were to set up local panel manufacturing, the demand that exists right now is just not enough for us to manufacture those panels economically using the same economics that China does right now.
Thank you. I think we'll be moving towards the last session of our discussion, and that is questions from participants in general, whatever questions they are posing. So the one question again and again it was appearing, that is on renegotiation of contracts. So Sadia, I'd like to just, Natasha earlier responded to this question and then we couldn't hear her. So if you'd like to comment on renegotiation of PPPA agreements and renegotiating other energy contracts.
Right. So, well, Natasha was talking about it. I was itching to answer this question because this is something that we're advising the government. We're working with the government on this, and this was happening, as Natasha said, pre-COVID times because power purchase cost in Pakistan is high. So, and a lot of people have been asking about, is this a situation for a force majeure? Now, CPPAG has actually told IPPs, and before this webinar, we actually had a call with the IFC team where they're having meetings with CPPAG where they've been told that they're going to default on their payments because, as we discussed, the cash flow problem is quite is big for the power sector right now. But I think this also is time when IPPs also understand that this is a problem and they're willing to find an amicable solution to this. So therefore, the negotiations with IPPs or discussions with IPPs had started before we hit the COVID problem. And so the government had a meeting with the government power producers yesterday, and they had a meeting with the 1994 power producers today, and also with 2002 IPPs. And they're meeting renewable energy producers next week. So there are a number of measures that they are talking to IPPs about, and this is basically reducing the return on equity, which can be done. And as the audit report says, these IPPs have earned a lot of profit over the years. So I have to say this was all done under legal framework. I mean, they got these returns based on the power purchase agreements that were inked by the government, and they were getting these tariffs because the regulator allowed that. But having said that, I think there's room for decreasing the capacity payment, especially at this point when power sector is in trouble. And so one is reducing the return on equity. Second is increasing the tenor of the loan. So if you increase the tenor of the loan from 10 years to 20 years, there's substantial decrease in capacity payments. So this is particularly very important for the IPPs that have come online in the last 5 years. And I'm talking about coal plants, or the CPEC plants, I'm talking about the RLNG plants. And while we demonizing IPPs, we also have to remember that 45% of the capacity payments are actually government-owned plants. Is coming from government-owned plants. So when I say that, I mean the Wabda Hydel. I'm talking about nuclear plants. I'm talking about the GENCOs, the Gudu 747 and Nandipur, and the RLNG plants. So the government is taking a lead on that and actually going to reduce the return on equity for these plants. And then they're also simultaneously they're talking to the IPPs to reduce their return equity or increase the tenor. And there's liquidity in the market, so they should be able to do that easily. And some calculations, rough calculations that we've done, that you can actually get a 10% reduction in the capacity payments by these measures alone. So I think this is the right time for the government and IPPs also understand that if these negotiations are not successful, there is a high chance that the government will not be able to pay them. So any cut that can be made right now, and of course this will also help in sustainability of the sector going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Sadia, for answering this question about renegotiation as well. I know we had a lot of questions from the legal side before. Unfortunately, we had to cut the conversation short. So now that we're in our general question and answer session, I wanted to ask a question posed to Natasha earlier, which was on basically the competitive bilateral contract market. So the question was that the Ministry of Energy is going to be taking the lead in coordinating this competitive market. So what is the impact of this new lead that the Ministry of Energy is taking in the implementation of this competitive market? Natasha, could you please answer this question? Thank
Can
you.
you hear me now? I think you'll be able.
Yes,
Okay.
yes, you're audible.
I think the Ministry of Energy, the key role for them right now is to start engaging with the sector. And I'm going to tie into Sadia's answer here slightly. I think right now we know that the IPPs are aware that they will not get full payment at this point in time because of the liquidity in the sector generally, right? So this might be a good time to start engaging with them to highlight that yes, there is a need to come out of these long-term take-or-pay contracts, and we can consider renegotiation in a way that that investment in other segments, for example, in the retail sector and all, is opened up. So this might be a good chance to show them that their investment in the sector can be sort of spread out, and if they are willing to partly trade their capacity on the competitive markets, at least they'll get paid for that component that they're not getting paid for. That is one thing. So I think that is one role that the ministry needs to play. It needs to engage with the sector if it wants to move toward competitive markets. That sort of engagement has not been very forthcoming in the past, and I hope that going forward it exists. The second thing they need to do, and I've stressed this before as well, I'm going to stress this again, they have to start engaging with the provinces at this stage. Their energy plays a role in the economic development across the country. And that economic development is going to drive from information given by the provincial governments, depending on their situation on ground. That coordination also is missing, the way I see it. So I think right now, what the ministry needs to be doing it has that CTBCM model from by CPPAG, which has been approved by NEPRA. I personally feel that needs to be reviewed in light of the amended NEPRA Act. There are certain discrepancies between the two documents which need to be looked at. But while that is happening, it is very important for the Ministry of Energy to start talking to the stakeholders. I understand those talks have already started. Sadia is confirming that. And they have to start talking to the provincial governments to take this matter forward and give it some proper shape. I think it's very important to start talking to each other.
Thank you, Natasha. So there is one question on energy efficiency. I'll refer it to Kamil and if Khurram Lalani is around. So that question is about energy efficiency. And the participant is asking, is there any law, institution or policy on energy efficiency? And supplementary question is, what is the penetration of LED bulbs in Pakistan? So Khurram and Kamil, if you can respond to energy efficiency, current infrastructure in terms of legislation, in terms of institutions, what's happening, and what do you think that moving forward, what should be done to improve it? Kamil, you can start.
Yeah. So I could not hear the question properly, but I guess the legislation or the inherent within any policy document of energy efficiency is it's basically the NEPRA Chapter 14, which is on electricity and it's on energy efficiency. That basically deals with, as a regulator, determines for not only for the distribution companies, but for all the stakeholders that they should engage in energy efficiency and some of those guidelines. But especially with regard to NECA as an energy efficiency and trying to take the role of the regulator with regard to its 5 sectors of buildings, transport, vehicles, equipments, and so on and so forth. I guess those are the 2 major links that you would see for any policy update and legislation with regard to energy efficiency in the country.
Okay. Khurram, are you around? Okay, no, Khurram is not. So there is another question, maybe Sadia can respond to it. So today's news is we'll be getting around $3 billion from foreign donors and payment relief from G20 and IMF due to COVID-19. Considering big recent drops in imports, how much do you think all this will impact the exchange rate and the trickle-down impact on generation costs?
Thank you, Naveed. So I'm not a macroeconomist. I can't really say what the impact on the exchange rate is going to be. Only some macroeconomists can tell that. But of course, I mean, this is going to well, I mean, of course, we also have a current account deficit. So even if there is decrease in or our rupee value increases, that would of course have a trickle effect on capacity payments, because as I said earlier, our capacity payments are linked to dollar, and the rupee devaluation has actually increased the capacity payments by 20-30%, or actually more. So any improvement in the exchange rate is going to decrease the generation cost. How much I don't have a figure right now, but that also, of course, at the end depends on what the exchange rate is going to be, and that also depends on a number of factors.
Seher, would you like to add to it? If Seher is around.
Yeah, I'm around.
Okay. So Seher, would you like to add to this answer that Sadia has shared with us in response to changes in this debt relief and energy cost? So what do you think? What would be its impact on?
I will echo what Sadia said. That obviously it will impact, like she rightfully pointed out, that the capacity payments are indexed to dollars. So there's dollar indexation allowed in the tariff. So obviously that will impact if the rupee value against dollar improves. But again, like I feel it's too early to comment on how macroeconomic factors would change and how the exchange rate will change in terms of impacting the cost of generation. But we do think as oil prices are going down, temporarily the cost of generation, the levelized cost of energy for thermal is expected to go down. But how that changes in the long run, how it impacts tariff, and also, yes, temporarily it will impact the merit order. So like if you look at the latest merit order that was actually came out a few days back, like some of the plants, like RFO plants that were like later were 21 in last month's merit order went up to 11 or 12. In terms of the cost of production, so the merit order works with the cheapest power going down all the way to like the cost of production as it increases. So obviously it will impact that. And just a slight note, I would just want to briefly touch on the energy efficiency discussion that was taking place in the question as well. From IFC, we work with with the private sector on resource efficiency, which includes energy efficiency, water efficiency, and chemical consumption, right? So there's, like, as Umar also pointed out, there is a concern that as cash flow is being impacted for industry significantly, energy efficiency, which was already being pushed over to suppliers or to factories in Pakistan through global brands, right? It was a global push that was coming. And so they were kind of forced to do that. So yes, with the cash flows tightening up, this will become a concern. But I feel if anything that this crisis has shown us is that climate change, the impact and the consequences of something that is happening will hit us all of a sudden really, really hard. Like, I personally believe that this unprecedented complete lockdown of the world based on a virus, like we were not expecting something like this a few months back, it re-emphasizes the importance of something like climate change and how that is happening. And yes, temporarily, like oil prices going down will impact renewables, but people who I feel countries and firms that are farsighted and smart in gauging this impact would be prepared for future changes, like future crises that will hit us, related to environmental changes that are happening. So I feel like resource efficiency, when we're talking about resilience of supply chain for the manufacturing sector, is a very, very important factor. And like smart companies will start realizing that and will have to push for it, not just a feel-good factor, but for sustainability of their own operations, because their bottom lines are going to be hit and are being hit, right? And these crises might become more regular as the nature basically keeps giving us a reminder of what we're doing. So just
thank you. Thank you, Seher. Khurram, I have a last question for you, and there was earlier discussion on the cash flow of the power sector. What do you think that how this COVID-19 crisis and demand and supply shocks, you mentioned it's not just demand shock, it's a supply shock as well. So what do you think the impact of this crisis on the cash flow of the power sector? And the second question was from one of the participants was, what should we expect in terms of energy pricing for consumers, after in the post-COVID-19 world?
Oh, well, I think again, taking the last question first, I think the tariff pricing is going to be a tricky one. Obviously, I think the government will have to raise the prices sooner or later, but they'll have to do it anyways. So I think 200 to 250 billion rupees is not going to be converted time soon. That's obviously going to be different. That's going to how play down both positive and negative for now. But what was the first question? I missed out the first question.
This was on the impact on cash flow of the power sector.
Obviously, I think, just off the cuff calculations, nothing, very coherent at this point in time, but just generally very rough calculations suggest that there's going to be a loss of around 150 to 200 billion rupees for during these, 2 to 3 months period. Now, if you want to utilize further, the consumers, then whatever is going to be that is going to be on top of that. So we're looking roughly at around 200 250 billion rupees, and that's going to be an additional impact to the power sector in terms of cash flows, which is obviously going to be built up in the circular debt.
Great. Thank you, Khurram, for answering so fully. And with this last question, we unfortunately are running out of time now. So we'll have to close this roundtable discussion. Thank you so much to all the participants, to all our speakers, particularly for taking out the time, to our audience members from all around the world, and a special thanks to our partners, Learners Republic, for partnering and collaborating with us on this roundtable discussion on the impact of energy and climate in Pakistan. This was a fascinating discussion, and for those of you who missed it, we did share this live on Facebook, so we'll share the link with you to this live discussion in case you've missed parts of it. But thank you to all of you for joining in this session, and we look forward to joining in further events with you. Goodbye.
At the end, I just have to say, Maha and Naveed, thank you for doing such a great job in moderating. And thank you everyone who joined. And we look forward to all of these participants joining us on all the webinars and all the future events that Women Energy and Learners Republic host.
Thank you, Naveed.
Absolutely.
Thank you
so much.
Thank you very much.
All right, thank you everyone. I'm just going to share the link with you in the chat section, and I'm just going to close this now. Thank you everyone.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.